Now let's take a look at news stories making headlines around the globe. First off, with Adamawa State Governor Amadu Fintiri all set to join the All Progressives Congress, the APC, the ruling party, is now set to effectively consolidate political control across 30 states of 36 states of the Federation, marking one of the most extensive territorial expansions by any party since the return to democratic rule in 1999. Fintiri's defection would be particularly significant because he is the governor of Atiku Abubakar's home state of Adamawa, with Atiku being one of the major contenders for the presidency in 2027. His own state governor joining forces to campaign for Tinubu's re-election is like taking the wind out of his sails. That's Atiku's sails. This consolidation followed the series of strategic political realignments, including the imminent formal reception of the governor of Kano State, Abba Yusuf, scheduled to be officially welcomed into the APC at a grand ceremony today, Monday. Senior party sources who requested anonymity said today's event in Kano is intended not only as a symbolic gesture, but as a demonstration of Kano's centrality to national politics, especially that of the Northwest. Moving on, the National Assembly announced on Sunday that it would reconvene its plenary session on Tuesday, February 17, 2026, cutting short its recess amid indications that lawmakers may review the date set for the 2027 presidential election. In a notice signed by the clerk to the National Assembly, Kamoro Gunlano, senators and members of the House of Representatives were directed to resume sitting at 11 a.m. and adjust their schedules accordingly, as very crucial decisions are expected to be taken during the session. According to reports, there is a possibility that the National Assembly may shift the presidential poll to February 13, 2027. The development comes barely a week after the Senate, bowing to public pressure, approved the electronic transmission of results to the Independent National Electoral Commission's results viewing portal, while retaining manual collation as a backup in areas where technology may fail. Moving on, Nigeria has endorsed key institutional reforms of the African Union and welcomed the return of Gabon and Guinea to the continental body following their political transitions. Speaking at a closed-door session of the 39th Ordinary Session of the Assembly of Heads of State and Government in Addis Ababa, Vice President Kashim Shettima, representing President Bola Tinubu, said Nigeria supports efforts to strengthen peace and security governance, democratic institutions, and development financing across Africa. He warned that the proliferation of small arms and light weapons continue to drive conflict and violent extremism in the region, and reaffirmed Nigeria's commitment to proposed Gulf of Guinea maritime security arrangements. Shettima has since returned to Abuja on Sunday after his engagement in Addis Ababa.
To ensure coordination within the African governance architecture and the African Peace and Security Architecture (AGA-AFSPA), including the proposed appointment of an independent committee to coordinate the AGA-AFSPA governance framework. We associate ourselves with the innovative proposal for the inclusion of a clause in relation to criteria for membership of the Peace and Security Council, as envisaged in Article 5 of the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council. We also support the inclusion of modalities for cooperation between the African Union and its Regional Economic Commission and regional mechanism in the Champions Report. It is our view that this is necessary to ensure predictability and effectiveness in our peace and security governance. We also agree on the imperative to strengthen coordination between the Peace and Security Council and the C10 Committee, particularly at the ambassadorial level. Mr. Chairman, regarding the African Standby Post, Nigeria welcomes the progress recorded thus far, and we encourage accelerated implementation of the provisions of the MOU between the Commissions and the RXRMs. We further support continued AU efforts to address unconstitutional changes of government and wish to underscore the imperative for good governance, including strengthening democratic institutions in our respective countries to address the scourge from its foundation. Mr. Chair, we support this streamlining the AU Summit agenda, continued PRC-led agenda classification, deeper analysis to advance the activation of the African Court of Justice and intensified advocacy for the ratification of the African Parliament Protocol.
Well, the Miyetti Allah Cattle Breeders Association of Nigeria, MACBAN, has condemned what it called attempts by the United States Congress to designate the organization as a violent and extremist organization. MACBAN, at a media briefing on Sunday, said the organization is legally registered, or is a legally registered corporate organization entity under Nigerian law, and for 4 decades, the association has operated openly, maintaining national, state, and local government structure across the Federation.
While we acknowledge the sovereignty right of the United States to deliberate on matters relating to religious freedom and human rights, we are deeply concerned that the emerging narratives surrounding this bill have increasingly sought to associate MACBAN, a lawful Nigerian association, with terrorism and mass atrocities. We categorically reject such insinuations as false, unfounded, and injurious to the integrity of a duly registered and a national association. The allegations suggesting that MACBAN engaged in support of killings are inaccurate, and sadly, MACBAN operates in full compliance with applicable Nigeria's through U.S. laws and regulatory requirements. We have not engaged in any form of criminal activities. 4, we are prepared to cooperate fully with any formal inquiry and provide relevant documentation to ensure transparency. And 5, MACBAN remains committed to the ethical operations, regulatory compliance, and constructive engagements with policymakers. And in a nutshell, MACBAN strongly disputes the allegation raised in recent congregational discussions. We operate in full compliance with all applicable laws and welcome the opportunity to clarify any misunderstanding through appropriate channels.
All right, these are some of the stories making the headlines this morning around the country. We find a number of things before us. With, again, defection, and if this happens, it means that APC-controlled states in Nigeria would be 30. These day newspaper in its reports details the states and the ramifications of Mr. Fintiri coming on board. Alongside that, of course, election matters, the Electoral Amendment Bill still in conversation, MACBAN responding, and others.
They have their choice to defect. I mean, defecting is not the problem. But I think the problem is the lacuna in our laws, where you are given a mandate by a political party, and you take the mandate by that political party and go to another political party. Look at somebody like Fintiri we're talking about. Is this not the same Fintiri that went at loggerheads with Binani of the APC then, that cried foul and said all sorts? But now it's easy for them, the defect. I think part of the things we should review in our laws is the fact that if a governor defects, he should be made to sweat for his shirts. They should organize another elections so that you can actually test his popularity. That's the way it's supposed to be. And in cases of even defection, there should be no proviso, because, you see, the proviso the people in the National Assembly run under is that if there's internal squabbles in the political party, that's an exit, that's an affirmation to defection. That's just like how we are saying that do not put any proviso in this electoral law as regards transmission of results. Because once you put in proviso, it's as good as not making the law. In the case of National Assembly, when members defect, the proviso they always run under is that there's internal party struggle. Even in parties where there were no internal party struggle, they will still run under that proviso. It happened with the YPP man, God bless his soul, Ufa Yoruba. YPP didn't have any internal struggle. But because, like they claim, they want to be close to the center, he went to the APC. There was no part, there was no struggle. And the YPP authority tried to take the case to court and all of that, but they couldn't thrive. So I think part of the things we should do in our law, if you want a great level of discipline, because you can see the flagrant indiscipline because they look for provisos in the law, is that once people defect, tell them to run in an election to see if they can keep the seats. Because it doesn't make sense. If a party, you came on the platform of a political party, they voted you in, and you take the same mandate given to that political party, so another party, then you should be able to sweat for your shirt. But I'm not surprised Fintiri is defecting. A lot of people are saying him and Atiku is Atiku state. I don't think things are really well between him and Atiku Abubakar. Things used to be well at some point in time, but I don't think as we speak today, things are well. But like we've always argued on this table, it's not how much defections you have that win an election. It's the people that decide the elections in the end. So, in fact, we should ask many of the governors, when are you going to the APC? The transfer season is still open. All of you can go if you want. But it is the people that will determine what will happen on election day. As regards the National Assembly meeting, yes, there's a strong point. If I remember this right, I think in 2003, elections too were supposed to be held, first dated to be held around the period for, I think, Christian holiday and all of that. I think it was shifted forward, if my memory serves me around, for Easter. So this one, there's a strong point because you want people to come out and vote. But I think the biggest story over the weekend as regards election was the point of view by Mikey Guinea and the letter he released to many media houses, where he nullified all the counter arguments people make as regards transmission. He said, not my words, that 97% of the area of coverage in this country has between 2G to 3G network. And the other areas, the 3%, they have effectively accounted for those areas. Those are the areas they call blind spots. They did this study before the elections. So the argument of the Senate falls flat on logic that 70% broadband, and because of that, you see, the Senate doesn't even understand the arguments. You are talking about broadband. What we are talking about is 700 kilobytes of data transfer. 2G, 3G will do it successfully. So the argument the Senate was trying to put forward was wrong. But I think the greatest argument we should now have should be about, number one, if what is on the IRF portal cannot be made justiciable as evidence, we are joking, no? We should ask for full transmission so that the process will go well. Once you put in provisos, any proviso that they put in that is accepted by generality is as good as not having an election. And mark it down. Mark my words. If they pass that law, with that proviso, the electoral rigging and shenanigan that happened in 2027 will be mind-blowing. Write it down. Bet it with me. Quote me. If they pass that law with that proviso, the rigging, Awamaridi rigging will happen 2027. Go and write it down. Because when they want to manipulate the system, they look for provisos. So we should be careful. I think we'll be able to nullify every argument. As regards those that make argument for network and everything, Igini worked in INEC based on the results, the research they did with NCC. 97% of the areas have 2 to 3G network. The last point, as regards ECOWAS, AU. For me, Africa is on tenterhooks. So this one that we have started a new pattern of endorsing people that forcefully take government through the military and now transit into democracy. Africa cannot move forward this way. Because if you complained about Bongo, Bryce Nguema might be worse. Dombaye in Guinea might also be the same. Accepting these people back is a total decision of damnation for Africa. Let's not say because they decided to change their spots and Dumbaye is wearing agbada, Bryce Nguema is wearing suit, they are not wearing khaki any longer. Africa can never be free this way. We are endorsing stupidity and mutiny. So that means any military can go and take over tomorrow, quickly hold shambolic elections, put themselves as democratically elected, right, with still a military toga, and you endorse them. AU, we have failed.
All right. Dr. Bati, take
Okay,
a note
first,
of-
with AU, very quickly. Now, we were represented by Vice President Kashim Shettima at that forum that held for 2 days, Friday, Saturday, last week. And Vice President Shettima addressed the plenary on the issues of reform, particularly of the Peace and Security Council. The major issues here were peace and stability in Africa, sustainable development, Africa getting a strong voice. And in the presentation by Nigeria's vice president, all of those issues were addressed. Let me just touch on a few of the issues that he talked about. With regard to AU reforms, which I've already outlined, he says Nigeria supports the idea of AU reforms to strengthen the Peace and Security Committee. And it was in that regard that he talked about the Joint Task Force to ensure peace and stability in the Guinea region, in the Guinea Basin, now Gulf of Guinea, as it is called. And Nigeria is the host of the headquarters of the Gulf of Guinea. And the vice president, speaking on behalf of President Tinubu, made it clear that Nigeria is not just going to host the headquarters, that Nigeria is committed to the idea of ensuring peace and stability in the Gulf of Guinea. And I think that that is important because it's a very notorious, region for piracy, for trafficking, almost second to the notoriety of the Gulf of Aden in the Horn of Africa. Now, he also talked about integration. He also talked along the lines of security about the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, which of course should be of interest to Nigeria in terms of the issues we have with terrorism and banditry. There was also the issue about the review of the criteria for the membership of the Peace and Security Council. That was another major issue there. There was also an issue about Article 5, the need to review Article 5 of the AU protocols dealing with cooperation among states. I think, in terms of these details, Nigeria had a good outing in saying that, yes, AU needs reform, and Nigeria, is in support of that reform. Nigeria didn't come back home empty-handed. Nigeria was able to secure a permanent seat on board of the African Central Bank, which is one of the issues we look for. 49 heads of state in attendance, including the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, with whom Nigeria had a meeting on the sidelines. And then we got commitment about Nigeria's frontline leadership in Africa. And also, of course, there were other leaders there. Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, was also in attendance. But it seems to me that generally, that EU summit, the footnotes, the undercurrent, is about trade, it's about Africa getting a voice, it's about Africa responding to the challenge from the United States under Trump, whether it is with foreign aid or development aid, as you otherwise call it, or with regard to health security in Africa, tariffs, trade, and how Africa can deepen intra-African trade within the purview, the umbrella of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, with about 29 countries having imposed upon them very high tariffs ranging from 11% to 25% by the United States. Now, on the issue of the National Assembly reconvening, now the Joint Consultative Committee, Conference Committee, it is called, on the harmonization of the amendment bill of the Electoral 2022 is meeting today. They were given last week a 1-week window within which they could reconcile the position of the Senate and the House of Representatives. So that would be of interest in the course of the week. What do they decide? What do they come up with in terms of electronic real-time transmission? The Senate, having decided last week to say that, look, we're not going to do real-time mandatory for reasons having to do with the failure of infrastructure, the level of penetration, as Senate Majority Leader Senator Bamidele Opeyemi pointed out over the weekend. The other meeting is the meeting that is scheduled for tomorrow. And we have been told that with INEC announcing the timetable and schedule of activities, some of the reactions is that February 20, which is for presidential and national assembly elections, will clash with Ramadan. Even Atiku Abubakar, Waziri Adamawa has pointed out that between that February 20 and March 8 will be Ramadan. So if you have presidential national assembly elections on February 20 and other elections, gubernatorial and state elections on March 6, it will fall within that window. We understand that is one of the things that the plenary, emergency plenary that has now been summoned for tomorrow will be looking at. So the question will be, okay, what does this mean? Is it sensitive? Is it divisive? Is religion now dictating the pace? Not to talk of other stakeholders who have said they are going to withdraw from the election because of Ramadan, because it will affect turnout and all of that. Now, as for defections, now we're told that the governor of Adamawa, Governor Fintiri, is going to declare officially for the APC today. He had said over the weekend that if it is the choice of his people that he should go in that direction, that is exactly what he will do. Well, we have made a point repeatedly on this table that it's never about the people. It's about the selfish interests of the politicians themselves. But what makes Adamawa important is that is the political local base of former Vice President Waziri Adamawa Atiku Abubakar, who is a chieftain of the African Democratic Congress, APC. Before now, his son declared for the APC. Now his governor is saying he too is going to the APC because that is the choice of his people. And President Tinubu, in the reports, we understand has been scheduled to go on a state visit, to Adamawa. So, this is this is an interesting game. Now, the APC is taking the battle to Atiku Abubakar in his homestead, even before the primaries. And that is really the subtext that people should look at. But at the end of the day, it's not just the Adamawa governor. It may be the 30th, right? 31st to defect. Then you have other governors. In Kano today, they are having a song and a dance to welcome Governor Abba Yusuf. Simi Fubara of River State will also be welcomed, and so on and so forth. However, Rufai earlier on was referring to the constitutional provision about defection and all of that. Well, the relevant sections of the Constitution is Section 68, sub 1G, and also Section 109, sub 1G. But it says political positions belong to the party. So it doesn't belong to you personally. When you defect, you leave the party. However, there's a proviso in that same Section 109 that says that you can only defect if there is a disruption, crisis in your party, and you can use that as the basis for defection. And there are, settled cases, case law on that particular matter. However, with regard to governors, it does not apply to governors. The Constitution is very vague, completely ambiguous about governors. And that is why the governors can just jump from one party to the other and they are not under pressure to relinquish their positions. However, the APC getting up to 31 governors and others coming, the other side of it is the position variously held that governors joining a political party does not necessarily mean that the votes in that state will go to that political party that they have ported into, to use Nigerian English. However, The APC has its own strategies. They are launching the most politically expansionist program ever since 1999, and everyone is going there. The question is, who is left in the opposition?
All right, who is left in the opposition? However, I'm glad, Dr. Batu, emphasized the fact that...
How many, however?
it's a however morning.
However.
Okay, let me get back to the story. However, the truth is that we have seen, even historically, through precedents, that it doesn't always mean that the fact that the governor of a party or the governor belonging to a political party automatically means that that state would be won by the party. And that's why I feel and I believe that the next elections in 2027 would test the people's resolve for change and to see how they would vote, whether go with the bandwagon. I mean, I already mentioned it earlier on last week that the APC as a ruling party seems to be doing its work. Whether you agree with the principles or not, some of it, some might even term as flouting the rules of the Electoral Act. But they have done, a lot of work. There's a City Boy movement. They're almost, in terms of covering all the grounds. City Boy movements being launched across the state. All the states, as many state governors as possible, defecting to the ruling party. The Electoral Act, the senators who belong to the ruling party, largely, many of them have made sure that there's a point in the act to almost favor the incumbent, and many areas like that. However, don't forget that in the 2023 elections, one of the key strongholds of the APC, in fact, the presidential candidate himself, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, was Lagos State. And despite all the work that they had done, they didn't win the presidential elections in Lagos State. And if you study the case of Lagos State, I'm just isolating that it happened in some other parts of the country, was that there was a third force and a movement that was led by the young people. And if you look at election cycles, even across the African continent, you would see, and even across the world, you would see a shift where people are willing to rise up to speak for themselves. And that's why it's very important that, yes, we're talking about states being captured, in quote, or defections, mass defections happening. But the power of the vote still lies with the people. The individuals, if the APC works for Nigerians and they want to vote along that line, then very much so let them vote. If other parties are the choice, as we saw the different options presented in the 2023 elections, then let people vote. One of the most important things is for INEC to present a free, fair and credible election so that it will be the will of the people. And then we won't need to have conversations around, yes, there's political weights that they carry in terms of the governor supporting the one party, but there's also something to be said for the voice and the power of each individual vote. The market woman feeling the pinch of the economy, the students out there, everybody has a voice, and that voice must collectively be heard in 2027. I believe for me that's the most, especially at this time where a number of people are talking about state capture politically, the APC, taking over many states in Nigeria. At the end of the day, the race is not over. I say this because if we continue to push that narrative, we might also be pushing an opportunity for voter apathy, where people feel that there's no need for them to come out to vote since it's already decided. No, it's not. As long as every Nigerian has one vote, then every voice must count, every voice must matter, and everybody must ensure that the institutions protect the rights of the people to determine who the elected leader would be, not the state governors. Yes, they have power. Yes, they have political machinery. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is to give the Nigerian people an opportunity to be the ones to select who their next leader will be. Now, going to the AU, I think it's important for the AU to go back to the drawing board. In 2002, when it transitioned from the OAU, moving away from core political solidarity, moving away from colonialization and apartheid, having done a lot of work largely, by 2002 they transitioned to now focusing on economic integration. And to be fair, 24 years later, Africa. I don't know to what extent they've been able to achieve that, because we're still talking about operationalizing the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I believe that rather than having a talk shop, it's time for Africa to be honest with itself. How can we want to be an economic power bloc when we are not even able to do business successfully and seamlessly with ourselves? How are we able to fight and stand as a trade heavyweight if we're still battling trying to protect democratic institutions on the continent? And that's why it was important for our Vice President Kashim Shettima to speak about one of the greatest threats to the African continent, which is insecurity and the lack of synergy across the countries on the continent to fight against insecurity, talking about the proliferation of small arms, which is a big challenge when it comes to fighting insecurity on the continent. And so if we're going to speak about being able to have that power share, especially in the emerging globalization of the world, then we must be very serious about the African Continental Trade Area, which is supposed to be a game changer in the way that we do business together, in the way that we're able to come together as a bloc rather than individual countries, and be able to compete favorably with the rest of the world and have a seat at the table. We keep talking about when we have, conferences, the United Nations to come together, we have summits, and yet our voices are not on the table. If Africa does not unite as a continent, if we still continue to hold our passports, our visas, we don't have, transportation, easy transportation across countries on the continent, if we continue to fight in isolation, insecurity, if we continue to have coups and the leaders are not bold enough to speak against unconstitutionality of taking over of powers, then we're not going to go anywhere. And I believe that's the focus. So we can come out with reports and talk about a number of things, but if we don't deal or we are not ready and bold to deal with the fundamental issues, Africa will still continue to lag behind when it comes to globalization and trade on the world stage, as we speak in 2026. So for me, what I would say is the takeaway would be, let's go back to the fundamentals. What's happening with the African Central Bank? Yes, they're giving the timeline now from 2028 to 2034. I pray and I hope that would come into materialization and not be pushed forward again. A number of things to be said economically, but I don't know to what extent the AU has been able to achieve its aims since 2002.